Sometime in the mid-1980s, a professor known only as Inge became the latest victim of a paranormal phenomenon that specifically targets visitors to the city of Florence, Italy. She had traveled alone from a small town in northern Europe, excited to see the city's Renaissance art. However, it was inside the historic Strozzi Chapel of Santa Maria Novella, where she had paused in front of the frescoes of biblical figures, that something deeply unsettling began to unfold, the beginning of a nightmare. Several of the figures began pointing out of the paintings and directly at her. This was followed by their voices whispering in her head, revealing information about her tragic family history. Little did Inge know that the anomalous phenomenon that had singled her out was a type of predatory parasite, one that seemingly had no intention of letting her go. Despite fleeing the chapel, it followed her across the city and back to her accommodation, where she began seeing flashes of light and experiencing other strange disturbances. Something was eating away at her consciousness. And by the time she was admitted to the local hospital, she was no longer Inge the professor. Her personality had been completely consumed by one of the figures in the paintings. In her mind, she had become that figure. What doctors may not have initially known was that similar reports were surfacing elsewhere, perhaps even at that exact same time. Not just in Italy, but also in the heart of the Levant, dangerously linked to a secret society born centuries earlier in Ottoman-era Turkey. One whose forbidden magic may have opened a gateway to something far older and far less human. An ancient horror that was incredibly hungry and part of an army of parasites may be connected to the Antichrist himself. And that this horror may even be on the radar of modern intelligence agencies worldwide. It's an open secret that global state agencies have long explored the occult to gain an edge over their enemies. And for decades, the CIA has been the most famous in such research. It's believed they were inspired by the KGB, who themselves drew inspiration from Germany's Heinrich Himmler, and perhaps even Japan's infamous Unit 731. But long before the 20th century, other state-aligned organizations were already experimenting with forces that lie beyond the boundaries of our reality, even evading the strict eye of the Ottoman Empire. Two of these organizations includes the Dönmeh, a dark messianic movement, and their successors, the Frankists. Drawing on Kabbalistic frameworks developed by Isaac Luria, they weren't just exploring the journey of the soul. They may have inadvertently laid the groundwork for something far more sinister: the arrival of the Antichrist. But who or what is the Antichrist within this context? Often described as the inverse of holiness, this figure's presence is said to bring about upheaval on a global scale. In Islam, we refer to him as the Al-Masih al-Dajjal. In classical Judaism, there's a figure known as Armilus, and in Christianity, he is the impostor Messiah. Throughout history, many individuals have been named as potential candidates, as heralds for the end of days, although the world never ended. But one man stands apart, Sabbatai Zevi, who as a 17th century mystic declared himself the Jewish Messiah and, as a consequence, was labeled by his rabbinical contemporaries as the Antichrist, at least for his generation, since his influence was far-reaching, and the year of his declaration was 1666. Here, under pressure from the Ottoman Empire, Zevi was forced to publicly renounce his faith. But while doing so, he secretly created a heretical doctrine fusing Islamic and Jewish mysticism into something darker. His followers became known as the Dönmeh, and their spiritual practices ranged from the desecration of the sacred to ritualized group intimacy. Although, like every other candidate for the position of the Antichrist, Zevi also died. And, as usual, the world didn't end. However, this is where his story gets strange. A century later, decades after his passing, Zevi seemingly returned, this time re-emerging in Eastern Europe. Here, an individual named Jacob Frank was born, and he declared himself the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, a soul reborn to complete the Heretics' mission. Now, before we continue, we need to jump forward 178 years to Cairo, Egypt, a pivotal moment in the history of Western occultism. As we explored in parts 1 and 2 of this series, the early 20th century saw the rise of secretive groups practicing a form of dark, radical Kabbalism, some would even call satanic. It's here the wife of Aleister Crowley, one of the key figures in this movement, allegedly encountered an entity that took the form of the ancient Egyptian figure Horus. She identified the deity on a stele, which at the time bore the catalog number 666, a number Crowley would embrace as his own, echoing the Antichrist of Christian tradition. Later, he claimed to receive the Book of the Law, dictated by a preterhuman entity that was a messenger of Horus. Thelema, the resulting work, soon shaped the direction of the Ordo Templi Orientis, which under Crowley and his disciple Kenneth Grant's influence incorporated a ritualization of sex. So how does this connect to Jacob Frank and his cult's activities? In recent decades, the iconography and ethos of Crowley's and Grant's occult orders have been embraced, or at least referenced by various elites, particularly within the entertainment industry. Crowley didn't invent this brand of occultism. The ritualistic use of Kabbalah in transgressive ways predates the OTO by centuries. The Dönmeh and the Frankists practiced it in forms arguably even more extreme than those outlined in Crowley's Thelema. With that said, a mild trigger warning for the next section. Jacob Frank's cult, active in the 18th century, took the Dönmeh's doctrine to darker extremes. As the self-proclaimed reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, he preached that spiritual redemption could only be achieved through sin. His followers inverted sacred rituals into profane acts, including parental and ritual partner exchange, even involving the most truly evil. And while centuries later, Crowley's and Grant's OTO would indulge in less extreme versions of these rites, themselves a corrupted outgrowth of Isaac Luria's Kabbalah, aimed at facilitating contact with parasitic extra-dimensional entities. Frank never explicitly named the Qliphoth, the home of these parasitic entities, in his teachings. Yet an ideological lineage can be traced from the Dönmeh to the Typhonian OTO, as all the core themes remained: spiritual descent, the inversion of divine order, and the belief that salvation could be drawn from darkness itself. He told his followers,
"I came not to elevate your spirits, but to humiliate you to the bottom of the abyss, where you can get no lower and where no man can rise from by his own forces, but only God can pull him with his mighty hand from the depth."
Now, due to social media restrictions, we can't describe in detail just how depraved some of these acts became, but we can draw thematic parallels. Both the Frankists and Crowley's adherents encouraged indulgence in the darkest forms of intimate transgression. However, while Crowley's use of the Kabbalah was framed as a means of accessing non-human realms and intelligences, such as the entity that allegedly appeared to him as the Egyptian deity Horus, among others of an eldritch nature, the Dönmeh and Frankists appeared, at least on the surface, more interested in transgression for transgression's sake, matching the MO of the Antichrist. In both Christian and Islamic eschatology, the deeper intent behind such inversion is well understood. The spirit of the Antichrist in Christian thought is marked by the deliberate subversion of divine truth, the promotion of false messiahs, the corruption of moral law, and the creation of an anti-kingdom opposed to God's order. In Islamic teachings, the agents of Dajjal pursue much the same aim, turning fitra, the natural divine order, upside down, and spreading falsehood and systemic corruption throughout society. Jacob Frank's movement aligned disturbingly well with these patterns. And while he wasn't the literal Antichrist, his self-proclamation as a messianic figure rubbed the rabbinical authorities the wrong way, especially since he led a sect whose core doctrine embraced the violation of divine law as a path to salvation. His stated aim was to corrupt religious and moral systems from within, and to establish a secret movement designed to perpetuate this inversion across generations. But how does any of this connect to the opening case study? The woman who seemingly encountered a supernatural anomaly in 1980s Florence, or to government interest in the paranormal. Beyond the thematic links tying the Frankist and Dönmeh movements to Aleister Crowley's OTO and their infamous rituals allegedly used to summon extra-dimensional entities, there are deeper, darker parallels. Both cults are believed to have infiltrated institutions, embedding their ideology into state structures. Notable historians like Gershom Scholem and Rifat Bali make the debated claim that the Dönmeh in particular held high-level influence within Ottoman and later Turkish state life. Later, Jacob Frank's movement found elite patronage in Poland, Moravia, and parts of the Habsburg Empire, where he eventually claimed nobility, amassing a following that included former rabbis, aristocrats, and clergy, implying a degree of state support. And this is where things start to spiral. Because by the time we bring the CIA's gateway process back into this narrative, along with time travel, what began as a story about heretical mysticism will veer into something far stranger than even Jacob Frank could have imagined. His doctrine of redemption through sin was radical, but like Crowley and Kenneth Grant, many researchers argue that Frankist rituals were not merely symbolic acts of rebellion. They carried a metaphysical intent, designed to invert divine structures and perhaps open doorways into realms beneath sacred creation. And as we will illustrate later in this episode, it is in those hidden realms where Eldritch beings seek to interact with human beings. And while Crowley, the Frankists, and the Dönmeh operated in vastly different historical contexts, all three drew from Kabbalistic concepts, including Gilgul, the cycle of reincarnation. According to some fringe researchers, Frank's system even aimed to carry this spiritual chaos across lifetimes, corrupting the soul's journey through reincarnation itself, not just breaking the world, but rewriting it across time. It's no surprise then that both Jewish and Ottoman religious authorities condemned him in the strongest possible terms. So how does all of this lead us to the CIA and time travel? Stay with us, because what we've laid out so far may seem like scattered fragments, but together they form a through line. By the 18th century, entire communities across Eastern Europe and even in the Ottoman Empire had flirted with Sabbatean ideology. As the Frankist movement gained momentum, its infiltration into religious and political institutions within Europe alarmed leading rabbinic authorities, who issued blanket excommunications against those embracing Frank's heretical freak-offs. This effectively dismantled the cult in public view, but while Jacob Frank's eventual passing may have marked the end of his movement on paper, persistent rumors suggest that his ideology survived underground, reappearing within established institutions and secret societies well beyond the circles of the OTO and into the modern world. Now, while certain blogs and ideologically driven media claim that a third iteration of the Dönmeh exists in modern-day Turkey, we'll avoid diving into that. Exploring it would veer this episode far off course and well beyond the scope and concern of this channel. Our focus is the esoteric and the paranormal. In Kabbalistic tradition, the soul undergoes multiple incarnations, or Gilgul, to achieve purification. But what if that cycle can be intercepted, redirected, or hijacked entirely? In the previous episode, we explored how preterhuman entities, whether you call them jinn, ultraterrestrials, or something else entirely, may have historically crossed into our world through human consciousness, using individuals as avatars to manifest their will. If these entities originate from the Qlipothic realm, and if they are indeed jinn as some believe, then as a species they can be both malevolent and benevolent. And as mentioned in the comments, the intent of the human seeking them, whether pure or corrupted, could determine the type of entity that responds. In other words, it's not just the realm that matters, but how and why we approach it. Now apply that to reincarnation, and to human figures whose behavior seems like a mockery of the sacred. Sabbatai Zevi declared himself the Messiah, and later Jacob Frank claimed to be Zevi's reincarnation, and in doing so birthed a secretive cult obsessed with a religious inversion. But what if neither of these men were truly reincarnated in the traditional sense? What if both were avatars, vessels for the same preterhuman intelligence, resurfacing through time, a consciousness not reborn, but reinserted, one that mimics reincarnation to conceal its true origin? And because its mission is inverted, anti-holy, its human hosts are perceived as Antichrist figures. Not the Antichrist, perhaps, but still agents of disruption. These entities return again and again, sometimes to complete a failed agenda, like Zevi's aborted messianic movement. Other times to sustain a bloodline or a hidden order's power across generations. Ergo, what we may be witnessing is not the return of a human soul, but the repetition of a parasite. This concept of hostile supernatural parasites is one that has occurred throughout history. Recently, in his essay on the nature of the Qlipoth, Frater Acher, a known figure in contemporary Western esotericism, explored the concept within Lurianic Kabbalah. He describes this dimension as continuously striving for nourishment, just like flames constantly need new coals to keep burning, yet, at the same time, they destroy. This depiction implies a parasitic existence, and these entities have even been known to manifest in random locations globally, depending on external sources to sustain themselves. Those sources being the human brain and soul. In a previous and somewhat disturbing investigation, we explored the phenomenon known as the Jerusalem Syndrome, an event in which otherwise ordinary individuals, upon arriving in the Holy City, experience a sudden onset of messianic delusions or prophetic fervor. According to the BBC, reported on the 15th of April, 2019, at the turn of the millennium, doctors from the Kfar Shaul Mental Health Center reported seeing this anomaly manifest in approximately 100 tourists within 1 year, 40 of whom needed hospital admission, affecting individuals from all religious backgrounds. The majority of afflicted individuals appeared to follow an almost identical textbook progression of mental decline within hours of entering the city. Their condition would gradually worsen until one of two things happen. Either they left the city or they left the country altogether. In both scenarios, their symptoms would suddenly vanish and they'd return to normal. Terrifyingly, in many instances of this anomaly's manifestation, a significant number of infected have no history of mental illness prior to arriving in the city. Furthermore, not all afflicted were even particularly religious. At the time, we suggested the possibility that these mental breakdowns were not random, but induced by non-human intelligences, commonly referred to in Gnostic texts written in 200 AD as archons, parasitic entities who manipulate perception and feed off the conscious mind. If that theory holds, then what's even more disturbing is how closely this aligns with certain strands of Kabbalistic thought, where the Qlipoth entities are described in strikingly similar terms. It may even represent a rare, tangible example of something from that realm manifesting here, in ours. Paranormal phenomena like this is rare, reported only in a handful of locations across the globe. Each location seems to operate under its own set of obscure conditions, affecting very specific groups of travelers, making the consistency of their experiences all the more difficult to dismiss as mere hysteria. For example, in the cold open for this episode, we introduced the mystery of a woman who was seemingly attacked by a paranormal entity within minutes of arriving in Florence, Italy. The New York Times reported on the incident on May 15, 1989. Similar to well-documented instances that had occurred in the Middle East, she was another victim of an anomalous event that, according to apocryphal biblical lore, could be caused by these parasitic entities from beyond our dimension. Much like the Jerusalem Syndrome between 1977 and 1986, more than 100 tourists were admitted to the local hospital after experiencing similarly uncanny episodes. According to the BBC, the Florentine psychiatrist Graziella Magarini said that all the victims' symptoms followed a chillingly consistent pattern, and in many cases, an overwhelming sense of alienation and identity dissolution. Sounds familiar? In the last episode, we explored how, in Lurianic Kabbalah, individuals touched by qlipothic forces may undergo a breakdown of the unified self, a spiritual fragmentation that can manifest as mental instability or as vivid experiences that feel like memories from other lives. Most curiously, it echoes findings in declassified US intelligence documents. In the CIA's Gateway process, Department of Defense analysts warned that remote viewers might suffer cognitive disintegration and even encounter what they described explicitly as non-human intelligences. The Gateway process, by the way, is a key component in this narrative that we will come back to very shortly. Ordinarily, alleged contact with such entities is said to require deliberate human engagement through ritual, altered states of consciousness, or symbolic transgression. With this in mind, Kenneth Grant, the controversial head of the Typhonian OTO, theorized that beneath the qlipoth lay a network of so-called Typhonian tunnels, wormholes connecting alternate dimensions. According to Grant, these are points of access to intelligences existing outside the known laws of reality. He claimed that through ritualized intimacy and other esoteric practices, practitioners could enter these spaces, and in doing so, come into contact with these entities. These beings, he suggested, were capable of exerting influence over human thought and behavior, manifesting through dreams, creative inspiration, and like with the Archons, cause psychological disturbance. Grant even argued that the work of H.P. Lovecraft was not pure invention, but a form of unconscious reception, a transmission of hidden truths disguised as fiction. And if there is any merit to that claim, then it raises one of many unsettling possibilities: that such parasitic forces, once granted access, might become a core component of popular culture, surviving across generations as a mimetic hazard. Ergo, the ultimate goal in all of this, at least theoretically as a thought experiment, is control. From the manipulation of Lurianic Kabbalah during the Ottoman era to the dark, ritualized practices of modern occultism, all in the service of maintaining power across generations. In this framework, the idea of elite bloodlines takes on a disturbing new context. What seems like reincarnation or a continuity of power is actually a long con, giving each generation a share of this world and membership of the elite that ultimately ends at the moment of death, with reincarnation never occurring. In this version, the elite aren't just perpetrators. They're also the victims. And maybe the Frankists and the Dönmeh were the first to fall for it. While this is largely theoretical speculation, it is based on writings spanning hundreds of years. From Ottoman-era heretical mysticism and fears of the Antichrist, to early 20th century Lovecraftian occultism, and finally to millennium-era Cold War science, taking us back to the CIA's Gateway process and the left-field topic of time travel. Trust me, things are about to get weird once all the pieces are assembled together in the final segment. As we explored in part 2 of this series, the US government launched a classified program called the gateway process, an attempt to move human consciousness beyond the boundaries of space and time. At first glance, it had nothing to do with Kabbalah. But the deeper we dug, the more it became clear the CIA had discovered some kind of afterlife or an extra-dimensional realm similar to the Qlipoth, and what we in Islam may refer to as the Jinn realm, or alternatively, Barzakh, a purgatorial space between space. As mentioned earlier, the now declassified report clearly states that consciousness, once reaching this realm, risks being exposed to unknown, possibly non-human intelligences. In other words, everything the Frankists and Typhonians sought to do through magic and ritual was now being tested by a military apparatus using scientific protocol. Officially, the program was shut down over 30 years ago, but in 2024, an independent researcher discovered that this technology may not just alter perception, but modify the structure of time itself. And if that's the case, then what began as heresy in the 1700s may now be influencing not just who returns in what they believe is reincarnation, but exactly when. In 2024, Alexander Onnemus, an American researcher, published several papers concerning the nature of consciousness and the existence of an extra-dimensional realm. One paper was titled Engineered Afterlife Preview 2.0, and another was a peer-reviewed study called Does the Gateway Process Allow Time Travel? Both papers build directly on the CIA's original declassified gateway process research from 1983 and its description of the absolute, that extra-dimensional space they discovered. Onnemus believes that human consciousness can be deliberately shifted into altered states where it escapes the normal flow of time and space, what the original CIA report called clicking out. His goal is to explain where consciousness goes after this life is over using a blend of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and quantum mechanics. In other words, he's endeavoring to illustrate that the CIA may have discovered a system that allows us to preview and even influence the physics of the afterlife itself. Onnemus proposes that the afterlife could be mapped and perhaps even engineered by entering altered states while still alive. His system involves lowering brainwave frequencies below what is known as the Planck distance, allowing consciousness to slip beyond normal spacetime. In this state, combined with advanced brain-computer interfaces and sometimes the use of psychedelic compounds, the subject would attempt to chart the dimensional pathways that consciousness follows after death. The process would be recorded and analyzed, building a map of the soul's journey across dimensions, knowledge that, in theory, could eventually be used to influence or direct that journey. If that sounds familiar, it should. In this and in earlier episodes, we explored how the Frankist cult and later occult groups like the Typhonian Order sought to control the soul's journey through the Qlipothic realms, using ritual magic and communion with preterhuman, archontic intelligences, or the Jinn. Their aim was to manipulate the reincarnation process, a technique others say can be used as a method to maintain a continuity of power across generations, to direct which souls came back and into which bloodlines. This, of course, ties into broadly speculative alternative theories concerning elite and secretive organizations, both human and non-human, be they humanoid lizards, aliens, or preterhuman species, holding the keys to reality through a continuity of power by various means. And while most of those theories are at the very least virtually impossible to verify because of their very nature, if the physics of these realms can now be manipulated directly, as derived from the gateway process through these quantum methods, then the need for the reincarnation method as a potential means of control, and the demand for dangerous contact with non-human entities to do so, becomes irrelevant. Onnemus argues that what the CIA, in conjunction with the Monroe Institute, laid the groundwork for is the ability to send human consciousness back in time. According to his model, time travel doesn't rewrite history, Instead, any backward movement of consciousness creates a new branch of reality, a new version of events. Essentially, each timeline becomes a new reality, a new version of history. Ergo, if you can control how consciousness moves through time and space, and if you can create new timelines at will, you no longer need to try to hijack reincarnation, especially if it does not even exist. You simply build a reality where you always win. So basically, this is not just time manipulation. It is the creation of timelines built for the purpose of experimentation. And when those realities can be created, shaped, and left to grow at will, what else can we call them but simulations? This, of course, is dangerously speculative and opens up an entirely different can of worms when concerning simulation theory and how God, faith, and free will fits into it, which we have no time to address. But back on topic, for those familiar with prophetic traditions, this mirrors exactly the kind of false engineered reality that the spirit of the Antichrist, across many faiths, has always been associated with. A counterfeit world designed to entrap the soul. This is conceptually consistent across Islamic, Christian, and esoteric traditions, where the Antichrist is not just a bad person. It is a complete system or reality and the embodiment of counterfeit enlightenment, inverted salvation, and simulated godhood. The control over a material reality designed to entrap souls. It is, in essence, everything the rabbinical authorities accused Sabbatai Zevi of practicing in Ottoman-era Turkey, but on a cosmic scale. So how does all of this connect? If you've made it this far into the episode and still feel a little lost, don't worry. There's one final piece to this mystery, one that ties everything together into a neat bow. And shout out to one of this channel's subscribers who brought this to our attention 2 weeks ago, just as we were initially wrapping up the episode. From the Antichrist, to the Kabbalah and its parasitic non-human intelligences, to the CIA and even simulation theory, it all converges on one individual. Salvador Freixedo, a former Catholic priest turned ufologist and researcher, who spent decades investigating the hidden forces behind religious phenomena. Unlike others in the UFO field, he didn't chase technology. He believed that parasitic non-human entities, or NHIs, act as part of a cosmic hierarchy of deception, intervening in human affairs not to guide us, but to feed on our suffering. Freixedo claimed these beings feed on the emotional energy generated by fear, pain, and despair. They operate through layered illusions, often presenting themselves as divine figures, spiritual guides, or even messiahs, similar to what we personally believe could be the possible Archon manifestations in Florence, Italy, and within the Jerusalem Syndrome, and in the ways the Dönmeh and Frankists, and to a far lesser extent even Aleister Crowley, became messianic Antichrist figureheads to their followers, while indulging in the most depraved acts of ritualized physical intimacy. But ultimately, according to Freixedo, these entities are only parasitic middlemen. He believed they serve higher, more obscure forces, hidden architects operating behind the veil of reality. And it's through that lens that we can finally draw all the elements from this Kabbalah conspiracy series into a single through line: the manipulation of human consciousness by anomalous forces, whether those forces are human or non-human. And in this episode in particular, that theme crystallizes through 3 key points. 1. Freixedo's non-human intelligences, parasites that feed on fear and suffering, are essentially qlipothic in nature. Spiritual predators offering counterfeit enlightenment while manipulating human consciousness. His warning that every layer of reality contains its own jailers fits almost perfectly with simulation theory, where each apparent escape is just another layer of control guarded by these entities, be they archons, jinn, preterhuman entities, extra-dimensional aliens, or whatever label you want. 2. The Sabbatean-Frankist heresy inverted Lurianic Kabbalah, using ritual and distorted doctrine to break followers down, blur moral boundaries, and sever them from spiritual clarity. The effect of their practices echoes Fraxedo's soul trap model: trauma during life, purification after death, and reincarnation without memory. We see similar patterns in modern occult groups like the OTO, and especially the Typhonian OTO, where rituals aim to dissolve the ego, open gateways to other entities, and promise transcendence. But through Frazedo's lens, this is just a rebranded version of the same trap. Systems that present themselves as spiritual evolution while keeping the soul on a leash, recycling it under a different name. But Frazedo also suggested the system isn't perfect, and we're paraphrasing here, but that higher vibrational states, self-awareness, and clarity of intention can disrupt the lower frequencies the system depends on to keep us trapped. And in that sense, his theory doesn't just align with fringe metaphysics, it echoes what many prophetic traditions have said for centuries. From across the Abrahamic faiths to Gnostic teachings and even Buddhist philosophy, the message is similar. That this world, what we call the Dönmeh, is in many ways an artificially constructed projection, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic, but always designed to distract, and in some interpretations, even feed off us like parasites. But like Neo in the Matrix, once you realize what you're inside of, there's always a way out. And on that optimistic note, what do you think? Do you have an Antichrist figure in your tradition? And what about the CIA? Do you think they know more than what they are letting on concerning monsters and parallel dimensions, and possibly even timelines? And as for simulation theory, do you think we could possibly be in a simulation? And does it even matter if we are? And finally, what about the Frankists and the Donmeh? Now, Turkish viewers may already be familiar with the Dönmeh and probably understand why we didn't dive too deep into their modern influence, as it's still a highly sensitive subject that falls way outside the esoteric comfort zone of this channel and not really appropriate for us to discuss. But whatever your view on any of the topics, let us know in the comments, and the mysterious Middle East will pin the most insightful ones. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and follow the channel on Twitter, links in the description. And inshallah, we'll see you in the next one with shorter episodes, meaning shorter gaps in between.